layer here. Now you can see we've got three different lights in the scene. We've got the top light, we've got the center light, which is the fill light coming from down here, and then we've got the left-hand light. Now the problem you can see here is that the transition between these sections isn't very aesthetically pleasing. It's very sharp and jagged, and it actually alters the way we perceive the shape of the model. Now when you're working with an object like this, a beautiful sculpt, you want to bring out as much natural shape as possible. So what we need to see happening here is a much easier transition. So basically, and I'm just a really bad drawer here, you just want to go in and start blending between these lights. But how do you actually do that? Well, you've got a couple of different things. The first thing you can do is change the position of the lights, and that's the first thing I recommend. The second thing you can do is you can change the intensity of the light. Now we can see here that this is quite dark, so I would recommend boosting that to get less of a gray to really strong white transition. Now the last thing you can do, and I recommend this least because technically speaking, if you're matching real world lights, and I will do that later on, I know it's difficult at this point, you won't have to adjust those because they will be real world values. But in CGI, we've got so much creative control over everything that it is physically possible just to go in and make the light bigger. But I wouldn't recommend doing that just yet until I've got a lesson out that has more realistic size lights, because like I said, the goal here is to transition between a real life set and a CGI set as closely as possible. So you're picking up on the tricks and subtle light placement that a real life photographer is using. So let's take a quick look at how I managed to fix this issue, and I'll just load up this render here. Really pay close attention to these areas, because now we're getting a really nice transition from the hottest area on the back of the object, and it rounds out into the softer areas down the bottom. Now it turned out when I actually increased the intensity and position of this light, I didn't feel like I needed to make that transition on the bottom side. We got a really nice transition around here, we got a nice transition on the arm going around, but most importantly the torso area just was as smooth as I could get it without nitpicking to the point of going insane during the middle of the recording. So this is where I know it's taken a while to get to this point in the lesson, but I've got to break this stuff down, because this is the type of stuff that will dictate not just this project, but every single project you do from this point forward. You've got to be able to pinpoint this stuff and know how to fix it. And the crazy thing about this is, and the thing that drove me actually insane in the next section of the lesson, is just how subtle the differences between the position of the lights can be that drastically alter things like this in the final render. So to the untrained eye, I see people do this all the time, and now that I've actually learned this a little bit more in depth because of the lesson, it's one of the most obvious things I see with people's lighting, not having those really nice transitions. So that's one of the things that you really got to focus on here. So we'll just zoom out. You can see one, just it's more natural. We're picking up more of a silhouette on the back edge. Now let's go into Max and see the difference between the two. You obviously see the difference in the render here is quite extreme, but in Max, and this is the scene we've got here, this is the scene that was rendered without the fix. This was the light placement, everything was all good. For this render, let me just unhide, very subtle change. You can see that the position of the light has moved, and I've reduced the size and shape of the object, but on top of that I've also changed the material of the object. Now I don't think that will have too much of an effect. I'll do more testing on this a bit later. This was just a coincidence, but essentially that's the difference between the two. That very subtle light placement, movement, but if you don't have a trained eye and you can't pinpoint these problems, you're going to be producing work like this, and it could have been better by moving it 1 foot over. I hope you can see the benefit of knowing how to pinpoint those problems. So now I feel like I've broken down this section fairly well. We're going to jump on to the next section. It's still not the final, but I'm going to transition to recreating one of Anatoly's setups so that you can get a better understanding of, in a more advanced way, how all the different lights can work together, especially on a more complicated scene. It's very easy to do this on a white, simple object like this, that you've got one hero object. But when you try and start to balance all the lighting in the scene, when you've got multiple objects, it becomes exponentially harder. And it's a skill set that's going to take a little bit of practice to get down perfectly. But the end result is your works do look better. In this next section, we're going to be taking a look at how to reverse engineer lighting based on reference. Now, I'll admit this section took a lot longer than I expected it would, but the reason for that is because I didn't want to settle on getting only 70 to 80% of the way there. I really wanted to truly understand what Anatoly was doing, what type of lights he was using, how he was working with those lights, and on top of that, I also wanted to find out how close the lighting is tied together with the set itself. And after doing all of that, and after doing hundreds of different variations trying to match his workflow, because remember, I didn't ask him early on how he'd done it. It was only later in the process where I started to confirm some things myself that I could go to him and just get that confirmation that I was going in the right direction. So after doing all of this work, I went through periods where I thought that maybe I wasn't going to be able to solve it. But now that I have, I can say that, I appreciate his work so much more for doing this, because it's taught me how sensitive light placement can be in tying together the composition in the scene. And it's also taught me how, as CGI artists, I think we've lost touch with some of the more old school techniques that photographers use to help shape their light and composition together. Because remember, as CGI artists, we have so much control over what we're doing. Sometimes we can lose track of the simple things that can make a drastic change to the way your image looks. So I'm going to be breaking down how I achieve this and the type of workflow that Anatoly uses just to really help solidify the composition in the scene. The first step in the process is going to be making sure you get your camera locked off. I can't stress how important it is, because if you don't, and you get the angle wrong or you get the focal length wrong, you can spend a long time going around in circles, because even though you might think that things are correct, you're actually seeing light come from a slightly different direction, and it can, even just that subtle, maybe 5 to 10 degrees you might have off, or a 5 to 10 mil you might have off in the focal length, can make it a really difficult process. And I'm saying that because I didn't spend the time the first time I did this and ended up getting the focal length wrong, and therefore I got the distances between the objects wrong, and I couldn't match the lighting, and I could have saved myself a lot of time just by spending a little bit more at the start and locking it off. So in a situation like this where you don't have any of the camera information and you don't want to use the perspective match tool because there's not enough information to base those lines off of, you've only got one choice left, and that's to have an educated guess of what you think the photographer has used. Now, in still life photography, most scenes just use a standard 50mm lens. So it's not a long lens and it's not a short lens, and that's because it resembles closely what the eye's seeing. So you're not getting as much distortion as some of the other longer or shorter lenses, so the distances between the objects feel quite natural. And in Anatoly's work, it just looks like something natural that you'd see with your eye, and for that reason, I started out by trying to match his scene with a 50mm lens. But by the time I'd finished experimenting, I ended up settling on a 55mm lens because it flattened things off a little bit more. Now, the way lenses work, the higher you go, the more squashed in the scene will feel, and the distance between the objects shrinks, and the shorter the lens you go, the distance between the objects feels larger than it actually is. Now, at this stage, the distance between 50mm and 55mm might not seem like much, but because the lighting has been set up so specifically for this exact composition, even having the objects just 2 to 3 centimeters spaced apart wrong can make this whole process really difficult. So just to kind of demonstrate that, here's the 55mm lens, the one that I settled on. You can see how everything's lined up, kind of 95 to 99% of the way there.
It's not totally off. Now when we go to the 50mm lens, you can see it's a very subtle difference, but it means in order to match to the 50mm lens, I've got to scale things up a little bit more. Now in a scene like this, where there's not really any spacing between the objects, when you make the object bigger, it means that you have to push the other objects further back into the scene and scale those up further. So once again, it's a small difference between 50 and 55mm, but the spacing between the objects ends up getting affected about 1 to 2 centimeters. So be careful when locking this stuff off early, because it's essential when you go and start trying to figure out how the set and the lighting set up. When you're happy you've matched the camera and you've got your objects locked off, you don't feel like you're going to change that anymore. The next step is going to be to figure out what's actually going on in the scene in terms of the lighting. So I'm going to go back into Photoshop and just take another look and try and figure out what's going on here. Now, when you first do this, there's two things that are going to help you the most. One of those is the reflections, and the other is the shadows in the scene. They're two things that retouching or grading doesn't affect. So if we zoom into the iron vase thing down here, you'll notice that there's a strange thing happening. We've kind of got a dark shadow and then a second lighter shadow coming off of that. What that tells me is that we've got a light coming from behind the scene, some kind of light source, maybe it's a window or a spotlight or the sun, but it's coming in and it's creating this shadow right about here. But we're getting this double shadow because there's actually a fill light in the scene that's casting a shadow that goes to about here. So the shadows reveal that there's two light sources there, but then the reflections do as well. So if we zoom in, you can see that there's kind of a, maybe on first glance, just a large reflection here. But once again, if I bring in a curve over this, and just drop that down, you can see the intensity of the pixels here kind of picks up in two different spots. So it's a very subtle difference between where those lights are, but they are two individual unique light sources. And they're the first two things that you want to put into the scene. Now those two primary light sources might be the main lights in the scene, but there could be other more subtle things contributing. So things like windows from behind the camera, creating some fill light from in the front. You might have things like a skylight from above that's creating some top-down lighting. That's not necessarily hard enough to create some harsh shadows, but it will change the way the scene's being lit. But if we zoom in, once again, you can take a look at the reflections just to try and figure that stuff out. And you can see that it looks like Anatoly's purposefully tried to make the rest of the scene as dark as possible. He doesn't want any random lights or kind of variables contributing to the way the front's lit. He just wants most of that light coming from those two main lights. Now, just before I add any lights to the scene, I just want you to see that this is a fully closed off set. The reason I've done this is because the stuff that's happening off screen can be just as important to the stuff happening on screen. So say for example, we have that light source coming from behind. If we zoom in here on the floor, we don't really get to see it and it doesn't look like it's being lit, but that's because it's off camera. But now if we go to the pearl, we can see that the cloth in the red here and the floor itself is highly illuminated, and that's causing some of that detail to pop into the pearl itself. So subtle things like that can contribute massively. So that's why I suggest if you're going to do a still life set, try and put some details around the scene as well, because they're going to reflect into things like the glass, and it might be subtle, but you know me, as you add that bit of extra detail, it gets closer and closer to photorealism. Now, when I first tried to light the scene here, I got a little bit tricked into thinking that it was being lit naturally with a sunlight or a moonlight or something like that, and then being complemented with a fill light from the front. So when I first set up the max scene, all I really had was a sun. Now, I've got the V-Ray IPR going here, and you can see that where I position the sun, I got it matching the shadows on the vase, and basically just try to match that directionality. Now, you can see straight away that it doesn't feel the same as the photo here, because we've got this strong light hitting the back wall that's not really visible. So even though the light's in the correct position, Because the sunlight is coming from an infinitely far away source and it has to be coming from outside, we're never going to get any direct light hitting the backboard itself. So without knowing the type of lighting setups that photographers use in the real world for things like this, I went down the wrong path. So it's always better to have that understanding of traditional photography, because when you look at it in hindsight, knowing that better how lights behave and the type of lights that photographers use, you can see the telltale signs. So by changing the light from a sunlight where it's kind of outside the scene and that light coming in isn't hitting the back wall directly, what I can do is I can change it to a spotlight or a disc light inside a V-Ray and move that light closer into the scene so that some of the light rays that are kind of being emanated out from that hit the back wall in the same way we're seeing here. I did notice a few things that were a little bit confusing though. There were parts of where the light was coming from that looked like they kind of get cut off a little bit. The other thing is too, we've got this really strong kind of stop off where the light hits, which didn't seem that natural. Usually if you've got a kind of spotlight hitting a certain area, it kind of fades off really nice and smoothly. But what we're seeing here is this, sharp drop off. It doesn't really make any sense. So later on, I realized that I had to factor in more of the retouching, because as more of an artist than a photographer, Anatoly does stuff like clones out problems in the scene, paints in his own gradients and textures into the scene, and those are the types of things that if you aren't factoring them in and you're just assuming that it's in the photo, can drive you crazy, because nothing you do will ever emulate that. So it was at this point where I stopped using the V-Ray Sun and I converted the lights to V-Ray disc lights. Now as you can see, by having the light a little bit in the scene, some of that direct lighting is going to be hitting the back wall. And if I swap to the lighting pass, you can see that hitting. Now of course the lighting pass is just the very first bounce that light is contributing to the scene. If I swap to the global illumination, you can see that that's also contributing, and it just softens off that kind of cone hitting the back wall. But essentially speaking, from here I began to play around and try and get the light's shadow lined up to the vase here at the front, as well as trying to simulate what was going on with the shadow on the jug itself. You can see straight away that by having just the light by itself, we're not getting that shadow that's appearing on the jug to the left over here. So that was a little bit of a mystery for me. So I actually went back and took a closer look at the reference to try and figure out maybe what was happening here. So with some of these still life sets, you can see that they're quite modular. For example, we've got a setup here where there's a hole in the roof and that light's only coming into a certain area of the scene. Once again, we've got an enclosed off situation here where the light's coming from above and entering the scene. You can see in this example, by having kind of part of the back wall covered, we get some weird shadows. So I assumed what was happening was that there's obviously some kind of board or something that Anatoly's put in here to start blocking off that light. Now at this point, I wasn't too focused on exactly where the light was in the scene. I just wanted to try and emulate this kind of darkness that was occurring in the corner. So I tried a few different things, not really knowing what was going on. See, just by duplicating this board here on the right and moving it into place, I'm not really trying to make things perfect. But essentially, I'm just trying to block off the light from entering into the scene. Now you can see from the reference, it's kind of dark behind here. I'll just swap back to that. It's dark in this area. And we're also getting this kind of shadow coming in. If we look closely, You can see it kind of is quite hard here, and then it fades off. But the problem is we've got too much light being blocked off from the left-hand side. So as I go to the left here and try and get that to reveal, we're starting to reveal too much light on the jug itself. And if you look closely, you can see it kind of goes from really bright to really dark quite quickly. So just this one variable in the scene that I wasn't sure how that was working sent me around in circles for a long time. It just seemed like no matter what I did, it was always being too lit or too occluded, and I couldn't match what was going on here. So I'll just go back into Photoshop and you can see one of my earliest attempts trying to get things locked off just using simple disc lights. Now, it's not too far off. It's, you know, to the untrained eye, you might think that you're getting away with replicating what Anatoly's doing. The problem is though, is that this is only 70% of the way there. You're not capturing all of the more subtle, intricate stuff that makes the scene look so nice. So for example, we've got some really strong global illumination bouncing up into the bottom of the jug here, and it's just helping create some shape across the surface. The other thing is too, you can see that I've got the shadows quite wrong. Mine are too short. But I was pretty happy with this for a while. It wasn't until I really looked at the two that I started to realize that I'd gotten things a little bit wrong. So for example, you can see in Anatoly's work, the light goes quite dark around this area. So once again, had I moved that light further to the right, or sorry, had I moved that blocker that I'd set up in the scene here further to the right, it would have caused that darkness on the back wall, but then all of a sudden it wouldn't have stopped working here. So I could go on all day explaining how I did things wrong in this scene by thinking that the light was the right size and in the right position when really it wasn't. It's very difficult though to match a scene like this when you can't see anything off screen. I had to think outside the box to find a solution and get things matching a lot more closely to what Anatoly was doing. So going back to the reference, I noticed that using a disc light isn't exactly the same as physically modeling the light. So you can see here in V-Ray, you know, we've got the light source, so the direction's going to be the same, but the way in which a light is built and the housing for the light changes the shadows drastically. So you can see it's actually not a disc light, it's a sphere, and the light is getting bounced and redirected into the scene from the dish surrounding the light. So I'm going to open up a scene which is going to demonstrate this a lot more clearly, because in a scene like this where we've got all this geometry on dark wood, it can be a little bit difficult to figure out exactly what's happening when we change the physical shape of the light. Just like when I was creating the Mastering V-Ray course and I was focusing tons on materials and just going in and just experimenting with everything, you'll notice I always try and do that testing on the simplest possible scene. That's just to avoid any confusion and get straight to the point and pinpoint what you're trying to solve. So looking at Anatoly's work, there's areas of the scene that have really nice soft shadows, but then there's other areas where the lighting's quite hard. And I couldn't figure that out, so by making a scene like this where I'm comparing two different lights to each other, you know, with the same object being, you know, where the shadow's being casted, I very quickly started to understand how you can alter the shadows drastically just by changing the housing of the light. Now let me just bring up the render I've got here. In this scene, the first render I want to show you, we've got two spherical lights here. These are identical. One's obviously got the housing on it and the other doesn't. So it's very interesting here the way that light's behaving. On the right hand scene in the shadow, you'll notice that it's very consistent, but you know, there is still a fall off here. So I think it's at this point I should break down how a shadow's actually being constructed. So in this example, I've just set up a small scene where we've got a spherical light and a cylinder blocking that light to demonstrate the different sections that make up a shadow. So the first area, which is completely occluded, that's called the umbra, which is Latin for shadow. Then we've got the area which is being partially occluded, called the penumbra or the near shadow. And then we've got the last area at the back, and this will only occur if the light source is bigger than the object that it's occluding, we get the antumbra, where kind of both sides overlap and create a dark spot. So you can change the shape and size of these areas just by changing the shape of the light. If I go smaller on the light source, the areas will shrink. So let me just do that. I'll swap it to half the radius of the light. Now you can see the umbra is much larger, and in fact we don't even get the antumbra anymore because this light source now is smaller than the cylinder itself. So we've only got the umbra and the penumbra. I can keep going smaller here just to demonstrate that this will just keep shrinking, and the umbra will start to get a lot bigger. And of course we can go the opposite way. I can make the light source much bigger. I'll obviously have to adjust the intensity. Now we can see we've got a very, very soft penumbra. The one thing I'm not showing in this scene though is how global illumination can affect the shape and size of the shadows as well. When you turn global illumination on, you can see that we've still got those distinct areas in the scene, except this time, because of those second and third and fourth rays bouncing around, filling in this area, everything appears a lot softer. So it's at this point where you can start to do some experiments with controlling where those GI rays are facing, using certain types of dishes around the lights themselves. In this example, I'm just demonstrating how the V-Ray lighting pass doesn't change when you put a dish over the light itself. The reason for that is because the lighting pass is only calculating that initial ray direction. So even though we get a shadow created, all the rays facing forwards that aren't occluded by that dish result in the exact same pass. However, when we swap to the global illumination pass, that's where you'll notice the difference. Now the reason for that is we're just getting into kind of fundamental lighting theory and how it bounces off of things. It's very simple. All the light coming from facing backwards out of that bulb, we can point that forward just by introducing something like this. So this test is a perfect example to show how global illumination can have a massive effect on the scene. Now like I said before, the only difference in this scene is that on the left, we've got the dish covering the light and redirecting some of that light that is hitting the roof on the right hand side back down onto the top of the teapot, and that's why we're seeing the teapot be a lot brighter on the left and a lot more flat on the right. Now the other interesting thing to note is that there's a kind of a trade-off here, is that when you redirect that global illumination onto the hero object itself, you're creating more contrast on the shapes of the object, except the shadows end up becoming softer. On the right hand side, you can see that the shadow remains quite hard, but the object itself is quite soft because we're getting more of that light bouncing off the walls and hitting the object. So if I go to the lighting pass, once again, you can see that that initial ray bounce remains identical across the two. The contrast in the object remains the same, but it's when you start to play with the global illumination that you can really drastically change the shape and size of the shadows. So at this point I got really curious as to why using a disc light wasn't behaving the same as a bulb with the dish surrounding it. So I set up a little test basically emulating the light from the left into the disc light on the right. How I did that was by creating a camera directly below the light source and just rendering that out, and I ended up with a result like this. And then I mapped that onto the disc light you're seeing on the right, so the area is still the exact same, but except this time, instead of all the light kind of bouncing around inside the dish, it's emanating directly from the light itself. Now the end result here is that we get a result that's kind of similar, but you can straight away see some really big differences in terms of the direct lighting, the shape of the shadows, and the shape of the contrast on the object itself. The reason you'll never be able to emulate what's happening with a disc light like on the right here, with a physical setup like on the left, isn't due to the texture or the intensity of the light source you're using on the disc, but it's due to the complexity of how the light rays are coming out. So basically the directionality of the light. Now when you're using a disc light with a texture, from each point on the surface, light by default is going to be coming out in a 180 degree kind of hemispherical direction. Now, as we increase the directionality in the light source itself, like we've got here, we can kind of hone those rays in so they're only facing forward, which in turn kind of redirects the energy. The issue though is that that's a very simple model of kind of what's happening. So even though the intensity of those rays changes based on the texture, the direction doesn't. So on the left here, where we've got the light bulb up on the top surface, light's going to be coming out at 360 degrees, and then it's going to start bouncing off of the dish. Now the difference here is that on this surface, all those rays are coming out like so, but on the right, say we have a light ray that bounces off of the side of the dish here and comes out from the surface at this angle. But then as that ray kind of hits this point of the surface, it comes out at this direction. Now there is going to be an infinite number of rays kind of bouncing around, contributing here. But the difference is that on this point, say that on that exact same point, the ray is coming out at that direction. On this side, the ray could be coming out at this direction. That's why we end up with completely different shadows, as well as completely different illumination on the object itself. So no matter what you do, no matter what type of texture you load, it doesn't matter if you've got something like Jorgen's HDRs here, you're never going to simulate the complexity, because not only is the texture important, but the distance and direction in which the rays are coming out of. So as I looked through the reference, I noticed time and time again that photographers were using these very large dish lights to create these nice soft shadows. So you can see here, even though we've got a kind of very strong light, the shadow that kind of edge of the box is creating is massive. As we begin to look through, you can see time and time again, it just keeps, those lights just keep coming up. So I just found a middle ground here and ended up creating a light that was, fairly similar, not perfect, but at least I knew I was going in the right direction. Still though, it didn't answer all of the questions. When I went back to the scene and put the physical lights in, replacing the dish lights, I still couldn't figure out a couple of things with the shadows. So at this point I went back to Anatoly and I asked him if he was doing anything with the set to kind of contribute to causing these shadows and changing the way the light was hitting. And thankfully he's been really helpful throughout the whole process. He's really been encouraged by the fact that I'm helping people learn here. So he revealed to me that he uses a trick to help shape and sculpt the shadows and where the light's going by placing paper over the light source and covering different areas of the light to gain extra control. So if I go back and I'll show you just a render of the final light setup from a perspective viewport so you can see what I mean here. So even though I had the lights in the correct position where Anatoly had put them, I didn't have light being blocked off from the light itself. So what you can see here is you can see the cone is being shaped by the fact that I'm covering different areas, and we end up with a really weird shape from which the light's coming out of. So I'm going to go back into Max and kind of demonstrate what this can do and how the version I implemented probably could have been improved if I utilized a two-sided material to let some of the light through. So the test I'm running now is designed to see the difference between completely blocking the light off with a solid object like we've got on the left and a semi-translucent object like the V-Ray two-sided material on the right. Now straight away, the first thing you can see is that by using a translucent material, we're letting some of the light through, and the transitions the shadow makes is a lot bigger. On the left, when we completely block that light off, the transition's much sharper. So this is why Anatoly's using paper. So inside the material here on the right, I've got the V-Ray two-sided. It's just a normal V-Ray material, and I've upped the translucency all to 255. Now you've got creative control here, so I can go down on the translucency. Now this is going to take a little bit to render. You can see that it's still more of a transition than the solid object. It's much softer, but it's still much harder than the fully translucent version. If I go all the way down, now we start to get much closer to what's happening on the left. And it was from here that I could finally go in and really understand what was happening when I was looking at Anatoly's reference. Up until this point, until I got to the bottom of how light was behaving, how he was transitioning the shadows, I couldn't figure out how he lit the scene. There was too many unanswered questions. But when you know the type of lights the photographer's using and the type of tricks he's using, like blocking off parts of the light and retouching, everything makes a lot more sense, and you can relax a little bit more in knowing that there's way less variables. Take it from me, because I spent, like I said, 2 to 3 weeks working on this, going around in circles, just basically brute forcing it and trying to make sure that I wasn't missing anything. Now, understanding what a photographer's doing is only going to get you so far. You've got to understand the theory behind why they're doing it as well. Now, in Anatoly's work, if you take a close look, you'll notice that the light positioned on the backboard is filling in kind of this area of the scene, this circle area. What it's doing, it's making the backboard extremely bright. So now on the objects that Anatoly has placed against them, in the shadowy areas, we're darker than the background, and in the highlighted areas, we're brighter than the background. So no matter where you are in the scene, he's always got that nice contrast. He's doing that by blending the two different lights together. And by changing the angle at which they're placed, you can get a kind of soft fade off between the scene. So the backlight here is kind of affecting this area of the scene, and the front light is affecting this area of the scene. So you end up with these kind of two circles where each light is focused on, and it's this in-between crossover period where we get the really nice transitions between the light and the dark. Now, I knew I had to have a physical model of the light set up in the scene, so I modeled that next and started trying to position the backlight to make everything correct. Now, I also knew that Anatoly had masked off maybe one or more sections of the light. I wasn't exactly sure where, but what that means is that I knew that the amount of light hitting certain areas of the scene was going to change, but no matter where I mask off that light, the shadow direction will remain the same. So the first thing I did was try and figure out a way to, as close as possible, set this light up in the correct position where it matched the shadows from the backplate. So the solution to that was to create a second piece of geometry, a plane in the center of the screen, and I'll just unhide that. Now on this material, I've got a V-Ray camera map per pixel texture inside of a V-Ray light material, and that's projecting Anatoly's backplate reference from the camera specified that I'm using, the 55mm lens. So let me just delete the 50mm here. Now the beautiful thing about this is, let me just move this over. Now in real time, I can move the light and see exactly how it's affecting compared to the backplate reference, because the camera is projecting onto that. Now to make sure that this isn't affecting the scene, I've right-clicked the object, and just go into the object properties and disable visible to reflection and refraction and receive and cast shadows. Now what I can do is, you can see as I move that to the right, I can get a much better feel for where things are going. Now from here, you've got to figure out how big the shadow penumbra size is. Now if we go back to those tests we were looking at earlier, we know that the size of the penumbra is dependent on the size of the light source itself. So there's two things that are going to contribute to that. The actual bulb, which is going to be affecting the direct area that's being hit. So let me just go in and swap to the lighting pass, so that everything in here, all the shadows in here, have a direct effect on the size of the bulb. So as I make that bigger, these become bigger. So that's how I ended up getting the size right. I just moved the reference image back and forth, playing with this size here until it locked off. I also adjusted the size of the dish around it, but that had a much more subtle effect on things. So let me just hide that plane there. Now you can see without everything masked, I know that the light's in the correct position because we've got the shadow matching, but obviously you can see on the back wall we've just got way too much light spilling onto it. So it is at this point where I started drawing my first plane to cover the light, Let me just unhide that. See, I've just got it a little bit inside. You know, even just subtle movements, if I have that a little bit further out, it can affect the scene. But straight away, you can see what's happening here. When I block the bottom half of the light, we're not letting in that light to this side of the scene. And this is where we get that real nice line coming from here, slicing over the jar here, and then filling into the left. So if we look at the direct lighting pass, you can see that more clearly. So that shadow on the reference here is a direct result of half of the light being, you know, occluded. So learning about this stuff, this to me was really eye-opening. It made me realize how little I knew about trying to blend the lighting and the composition together. You can see that Anatoly has placed the object to be, you know, just half in the light. And I wish that we had a little bit more real-time feedback, because when you're dealing with global illumination, you can see even on a computer like mine with 20 cores, it's still a little bit slow with the secondary GI stuff. The direct rays, you know, they happen amazingly fast. But when we start working more with indirect light and V-Ray, things do slow down. Now, I could have left it here, but I just wanted to play around a little bit more. And when I started, I put this kind of blockade over the light, and I was like, oh my God, finally I've figured out how he put that shadow in the scene. But I also realized that going back to the reference, something was a little bit off at the top as well, and that I could have probably masked, that he maybe masked more than one area. So let me just unhide the other little pieces. Now, it might not seem like much, but let me just let this render for a second. Save this off. Now let me hide these two sections. And let me just do a quick comparison there for you. So once again, very small, very insignificant. But if we look at the before and after, we can see the amount of light we've blocked coming on the back wall there. It's not really affecting everything else in the scene. Everything else is nice and evenly lit. But because we're stopping it in this area here, closest to the wall, we're stopping a ton of that light. And we end up changing the contrast in the shadow here. And you can see now that fade off and the penumbra size, you know, where it transitions from fully occluded to not, gets stretched out quite a lot. Now when you go to the reference, you'll notice he's got a really nice soft transition here, and on the top as well. Now there's one little thing I wanted to discuss here, and when I set the light up and I thought I'd gotten everything correct, there was one thing that I was kind of lacking in the scene. Now if we go to the reference, you'll notice in the shadowy areas, we've got this really nice strong light that looks like it's bouncing up from the table itself. So having the light by itself here, once again, let me just get rid of the history. We can see that even though the light's in the correct position, maybe not the right amount of light is being cast into the scene. We're not getting that really strong bounce light from the center. Now, I'm assuming the reason for that is because the model I've created for this light isn't physical enough to concentrate those rays more towards the center and bounce them back up in the scene. So to experiment with that, I placed an additional light inside of the dish here. And in the settings for that light, I set the directionality to be 0.99. And I made the light quite powerful. And by turning this light on, you'll see what happens here. This is just a really small hotspot beam that's kind of getting cast into the scene. But as I let this render, you see the global illumination bouncing back up into the jar here and underneath and on the handle. And I wasn't getting that without that additional light in there. Now, this isn't physical. This isn't how the real light is going to be behaving. I'm just trying to kind of capture that level of detail that we sometimes miss when using simple standard lights. So that's why I feel like this lesson was a real eye-opener for me, because you can approach lighting with the same detail as materials. So now let's go back into the reference. You can see that there's clearly something here that's bouncing that light back in. So possibly the way the light's structured, some of it is being, a really strong beam is being cast, and kind of one of the telltale signs for that is the brightest area in the image is on the wood, at least down the bottom, is dead center here. So that's exactly where this beam is going. It's getting beamed, as you can see, right down in between all the three jugs here, and then it's just bouncing that light back up. I think with a bit more practice and a bit more study of how real lights are affecting different objects, I'll be able to simulate this a lot better so that you don't have to have things like this, but it is something that's really important to look out for, because we focus so much on the direct lighting proportion of the scene that the extra detail that having really nice global illumination brings is invaluable. Now, after I locked the back light off, I used the exact same process to get the fill light from the side locked off. Now, one of the things that I felt helped during the process was locking the outside casing to the light itself. So to do that, I used the select and link tool, and you can just drag and hover over onto the light. So what happens is now when I move that light, the dish follows along with it. Now to lock it off, once again you see I've got the reference image kind of half overlapping, and I've put the light exactly where the two shadows kind of cross and meet. If I go too high on the light, you'll see that the shadow's a little bit off, it kind of comes too far. And if I go side on the light, we're going to be filling too far in and it doesn't match. So by using that method, I've just got it locked off as close as possible. Now I'm not saying it's perfect, I know there's a slight angle kind of error here, but that could be due to a number of things. The wood might be warping, might be kind of indented a little bit. The shape and size of the light could be affecting that. But essentially speaking, I know I'm pretty close when I've got those two kind of lapping over each other. Now if I move this reference image to the right, there is an area here where you can see that the two lights kind of cross over. So once again, just dragging this out, you can start to see that as my light fades off, it's not perfect, but it's pretty close. So let's turn the backlight on. Now you can see that the fill from the backlight here kind of changes the shape of the penumbra, or the umbra, sorry. And it's right on the edge of the cylinder, which I put as a marker for where that shadow goes. Now of course, I'll just turn the backlight off once again. And I'll hide the reference. You can see that without blocking any of this light, we've just got way too much coming in. So I've locked off the shadow, but now I've got to go in and make the same kind of blocker that I did on the backlights. Now I ended up putting that blocker on the bottom side because what I was trying to do here is only highlight the center of the table. Now you can see what this light is doing is it's hitting the floor and bouncing some of that light up on the front side of the table. And near the edge here where that light fades off, it goes darker. And that's what's happening in our reference. You can see the light bouncing up from the floor is illuminating the front side of the table, and then on the left here it just fades. The other reason why I blocked it over here was because I didn't want too much light being cast onto the left-hand side of the jug. Now it's very interesting to note here that the direct lighting portion of where this light's hitting is only a very small area. It's where you get all the character from that light is the stuff bouncing back up into the scene. And all those secondary bounces create a really nice soft kind of rounded shape across all of the objects. You get these really nice transitional shadows. So just using a combination of the indirect lighting and that direct lighting, and you can really put focus on where you want that light to affect. Now I've just let V-Ray render for a little bit longer. You can see one of the most beneficial things to using this technique is that in some areas where you get masked off, you create a much softer transition in the shadows. Now if we go to Anatoly's reference here, you can see that that fill light is kind of contributing to about this area here. This is where the light kind of side drops off, and we go into the darkness from the backlight that's rounding around. So we're getting two different types of lights contributing. We're getting the backlight, which is casting the GI up into the scene, which is once again indirect light, and we get that nice soft transition. And then on the side light, we get that another soft transition from the bounce light kind of coming off the floor. So the end result is that this whole area becomes a lot softer. This actually did my head in. I nearly went crazy trying to figure out why I couldn't get a light to be in the right position and not have a really strong contrasty, edge to it. So let me unhide this. You can see it's really ugly. You get this really sharp, strong transition. And I tried so many things with the disc light. I tried painting in my own light source, but nothing will work like having the indirect lighting do it. Now from here I had both lights locked off, but there was still something that was confusing me a little bit. If we zoom in on the glass objects here, you can see what looks like an additional light source kind of around this area that I couldn't figure out where that was coming from, because in the shadows you can see that we've clearly only got two light sources strong enough to be affecting that. And that's when it hit me that I was probably overthinking it a little bit, because if there was a window up there that was a little bit dim, it would be showing up in the glass fairly strong. But if it wasn't as intense as a light kind of directly beaming in onto the scene, it might not be noticeable in the lighting part. So maybe that area was something that was going to be more affected by reflections. So I put a light in up the top here, and I just applied a window texture to it using one of Jorgen's HDRs. And just once again, just to block off some of the light and make it a bit more smooth, I've used a light that's been covered with a curtain. So I moved that into place. And if I zoom in, you can see that that light is kind of affecting the center of the jug here. Now once again, I know that these aren't in the exact right position, but the modeling I've got is wrong, and if even the positions of the lights are just slightly off, or the camera's slightly off, then it's going to affect it quite drastically. There's one more thing you can consider. You can see I've got a light coming from behind the camera here. Now, whether you use this is up to you. You can see that on the glass objects we're picking up some reflection from the floor in the scene. So this area here. And just to demonstrate that, I'm just going to stop the render and disable. You can see that now that I've got a fully closed off room, the way the light's hitting the floor here directly affects the objects from the camera's point of view. So everything's contributing. We've got the two hero lights that Anatoly's set up strategically to get the objects in the scene, looking nice against the background. Then we've got some additional natural light coming in from the window at the top here. So I'm just going to disable these two lights, and you can just see the effect that the window's having. It's a very subtle effect in the scene. And from the camera's point of view, with all the correct exposure settings set up, like I expected, the light's bright enough to affect the glass, but not bright enough to really affect anything else in the scene. Now there's one more thing to consider in the scene, and I'm going to save a more detailed explanation of this to another lesson, but a photographer can always change the color of the light by applying gels over the top. So I just bring up an example here. They're just, translucent pieces of plastic or material that kind of filter the light and change the color. Now in Anatoly's scene, you'll notice that there's a very strong blue tint to everything. Now of course, most of that is probably coming from retouching the image, but on top of that, the blue tint we're getting even in the highlights could be an indication that he's applied a blue filter to the lights. So if the globes themselves are fairly orange by default, I've gone in and changed the mode and the color of the light just to be slightly blue. Now if I really crank that up, you notice the effect it can have in the scene. So I just eyeballed that. You can see there's actually maybe a subtle purple here. So if I go into the color, just want to make it a subtle effect and just kind of get maybe a little bit closer to light blue. And I'll just region render this area. See, it's a bit too strong. So once again, I'll just keep going blue. Going to drop off on some of that saturation. And I'll just keep swapping back and forth, trying to match those colors. Now I really hope this section has demonstrated just how effective Anatoly can be at kind of controlling the light in the scene and positioning them in a place that creates really interesting composition. Now on top of that, hopefully you can see that the stuff that's not visible on screen can be just as important as the stuff on screen. You can see I've got a piece of wood here on the left. Now if I want to darken off this area more, we know how much of an effect having brighter objects in the scene can be at bouncing some light around. So let me just apply a perfectly black V-Ray material to this. Now we've darkened off that entire left corner. Now in reality, I can't imagine him carrying around a piece of black board perfectly like this. So everything has a little bit of diffuse. Don't go to extremes. Try and keep things in the realm of realism in terms of the colors you're using. But you can also see I've tried to factor in, okay, what if Anatoly set up a physical scene here, but where is he actually positioning the lights? So the backboard here, even though it's intersecting a little bit, it's only intersecting the area where the paper's sitting. The light itself is still sitting in a physical in a physical space. I put a little board here, and that's just to block off more light coming from underneath. You can see that all that light here that would be hitting the scene is getting stopped. And I was really happy with getting to where I got to in this scene. It taught me heaps about how to control light, how to work with proper lights in the scene, not just cylindrical disc lights or spherical lights, but to really go in and model the lights. Now, the last thing I want to take from this is that, you know how I explained having a disc light doesn't emulate the direction the light's coming from? If you were to use an IES light, that system actually does calculate for the direction the light rays are coming from the point. So what I need to do from here is I need to make a lesson comparing IES profiles to real physical lights that I've modeled to see just how accurate they are and get to the bottom of lighting in the same way I did with materials. In the next section, I'm going to be showcasing how I lit my main scene, which I won't lie, it was a little bit more simple than this setup here, which is why I ended up doing this setup. But more importantly, I'm going to be breaking down how I did the retouching in my final scene and how I used some tricks to really bring out the depth in the image. Thanks heaps for patiently waiting for this lesson. I put everything I could into it in re-understanding light and getting away from purely reflective light and direct light. I really wanted to try and replicate what was happening on a real world set. And I think moving into the future, if I were to make my own projects again, I definitely utilize techniques like this because it has a much more natural feel to it. Thanks heaps, guys. I've got one more section to go and then we finally made it. I can get on to some new stuff.